October 9th, 1979, Rome. Father Giuseppe Benedetti adjusted his clerical collar as he stepped onto Via Veneto, the autumn rain drumming against the cobblestones with a persistence that matched his heartbeat. To any passerby, he was simply another priest navigating the eternal city's crowded streets, perhaps heading to evening prayers or a quiet dinner in one of the trattorias tucked between Renaissance palazzos. The red Fiat parked across from Café de Paris held no particular significance to the tourists photographing the Trevi fountain 3 blocks away. They believed Rome was a city of ancient history, where the most dangerous thing lurking in shadows was pickpockets or overpriced gelato. They had no idea that beneath the city's romantic facade, a different kind of war was being waged, one where prayers were cover stories and communion wine masked the bitter taste of revenge. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. The man who called himself Father Benedetti was neither Italian nor a priest. His real name was David Kimche, though even that identity would dissolve like smoke if anyone looked too closely. The 38-year-old Mossad operative had spent the last 4 months learning to cross himself with the fluid grace of a lifelong Catholic, to recite the rosary in flawless Italian with just the hint of a Tuscan accent, to walk with the measured, contemplative pace of a man whose thoughts were on heaven rather than the .40 caliber Beretta concealed beneath his cassock. The costume was perfect, down to the scuffed leather shoes, purchased second-hand from a shop in Trastevere, worn exactly as a parish priest on a modest salary would wear them. The preparation for this role had been exhaustive, bordering on obsessive. Kimche had spent 6 weeks at a safe house outside Florence, studying with a former priest who had left the church and now worked quietly for Israeli intelligence. The man, who Kimche knew only as Paolo, had been ruthlessly thorough. Morning prayers at precisely 6 o'clock, breakfast of black coffee and plain bread, then hours of instruction on Catholic liturgy, the rituals of Mass, the proper way to hear confession, the subtle gestures that marked a man who had spent decades in service to the church. Paolo had been particularly demanding about the small things, the way a priest holds his hands when walking, never quite relaxed, but not clasped in obvious prayer either. The angle of the head when listening to parishioners, slightly tilted, conveying both authority and compassion. The pace of speech when delivering blessings, measured and deliberate, each word given its proper weight. Even the smell was important. Paolo insisted Kimche use a particular brand of incense-scented soap, wear clothes that had been stored with cedar and frankincense, details that would register subconsciously to anyone familiar with Catholic clergy. The hardest part had been the confession booth training. Paolo had constructed a makeshift confessional in the safe house and made Kimche sit through hour after hour of simulated confessions, playing both priest and penitent until the responses became automatic. The rhythm of it, the comforting formulas, the careful balance between judgment and forgiveness. It was a kind of theater. Kimche realized, not so different from the roles he had played in other operations, but this one required a depth of understanding that went beyond surface mimicry. He needed to think like a priest, to embody the worldview, to make the disguise not just visual, but psychological. Inside the Fiat, another priest sat reading L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican newspaper. Father Marco, as his falsified papers identified him, was actually Ehud Barak, 27 years old, his hands more accustomed to dismantling explosives than turning rosary beads. The newspaper trembled slightly as a gust of wind rattled the car windows. He turned a page, eyes never leaving the entrance to the apartment building at number 43 Via Veneto. 3rd floor, 2nd window from the left. They had been watching that window for 117 days. Barak's path to this moment had been different from Kimche's. While Kimche was career intelligence, a man who had grown up in the shadows of espionage, Barak had started in the military, special forces, a soldier who understood violence in its most direct form. He had been recruited to Mossad 3 years earlier after a mission in Lebanon, where his tactical brilliance had saved his entire unit from a Syrian ambush. Someone in Tel Aviv had noticed, and 6 months later, he was sitting in a windowless room being offered a different kind of war to fight. The transition had not been easy. Soldiers operated in clear hierarchies, with defined objectives and rules of engagement. Intelligence work was murkier, all shades of grey, victories that looked like defeats, and defeats that were secretly victories. He had struggled with it at first, the waiting, the watching, the patient accumulation of tiny fragments of information that might or might not lead anywhere. But he had learned, had adapted, had discovered that he possessed a talent for the work that surprised even his trainers. The Rome operation was his 6th major assignment, and by far the most important. Munich had happened when he was 19 years old, still in basic training, but the impact had shaped his entire military career. Every operation, every mission, every moment of danger had been motivated by the memory of those 11 athletes, by the conviction that Israel could never again be helpless in the face of terrorism. Salameh represented the apotheosis of that threat, the brilliant, charismatic leader who had turned the Olympics into a massacre. Getting him was not just another operation, it was the operation, the one that would define everything that came after. The target had a name that sent chills through Israeli intelligence: Ali Hassan Salameh, the Red Prince, architect of Black September, mastermind behind the Munich massacre that had left 11 Israeli athletes dead 7 years earlier. Since that September day in 1972, when the world watched in horror as masked terrorists turned the Olympics into a killing ground, Salameh had become the embodiment of everything Mossad hunted. He was brilliant, ruthless, and maddeningly elusive, slipping through their fingers in Beirut, vanishing in Cyprus, always one step ahead. The intelligence file on Salameh was thick enough to fill 3 filing cabinets in Tel Aviv, a testament to years of obsessive surveillance and frustrated pursuit. He had been born in Jaffa in 1940, the son of a prominent Palestinian family displaced by the creation of Israel. His father, Hassan Salameh, had been a fighter during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, killed in action when Ali was only 8 years old. That loss had shaped everything that came after, transforming a privileged child into a dedicated revolutionary. By his 20s, Salameh was already a rising star in Fatah, Yasser Arafat's political faction within the PLO. He was educated, spoke multiple languages, moved comfortably in European circles, while maintaining credibility with the most radical Palestinian fighters. He was also handsome, charming, the kind of man who could walk into a room and command attention without saying a word. Western journalists called him the Red Prince, partly for his leftist politics, partly for his aristocratic bearing, partly because he seemed to live a life of luxury even while organizing terrorist operations. But beneath the sophisticated exterior was a mind that understood violence with cold precision. Salameh had not personally pulled triggers at Munich, but he had orchestrated every detail, from recruiting the Black September operatives to coordinating with German sympathizers who helped smuggle weapons into the Olympic Village. He had understood exactly how to maximize the psychological impact, how to turn a sporting event into a global nightmare, how to ensure that the images of masked terrorists holding Israeli athletes hostage would burn into collective memory forever. Mossad's pursuit of Salameh had become increasingly desperate over the years. They had tracked him to Madrid in 1973, set up an elaborate surveillance network, only to have him vanish hours before a planned intercept. They had nearly caught him in Athens 6 months later, but a source had been compromised and Salameh had been warned. There had been close calls in Paris, in Copenhagen, in Frankfurt. Each time he slipped away, always maintaining his networks, always planning new operations, always staying just beyond reach. But intelligence was an art of patience, and Mossad had learned patience the hard way. After Munich, Prime Minister Golda Meir had authorized Operation Wrath of God, a systematic campaign to hunt down every person involved in the massacre. The operatives who carried out these missions became ghosts themselves, assuming identities as varied as the cities they haunted. They had been Canadian businessmen in Paris, Norwegian tourists in Athens, German students in Frankfurt, and now, in Rome, they were priests. The decision to use clerical disguises had come from Rafi Eitan, one of Mossad's most legendary field agents, the man who had captured Adolf Eichmann in Argentina nearly 2 decades earlier. Aitan understood that the best disguises were those that made people look away rather than look closer. A priest commanded a certain invisible respect, a buffer zone of privacy that even the most suspicious observer hesitated to violate. In Catholic Rome, surrounded by thousands of genuine clergy, 2 more black cassocks would blend into the urban landscape like salt dissolving in the sea. David Kimchi watched the rain intensify, turning Via Veneto into a river of reflected neon and headlights. His hand instinctively moved to the small crucifix hanging from his neck, another detail that had required weeks of practice. The weight of it still felt foreign, but his fingers now moved over it with the unconscious familiarity of genuine faith. Every gesture, every mannerism had been rehearsed until they became muscle memory. Mossad training was nothing if not thorough. The intelligence that had led them to Rome had come through channels so convoluted that even Kimche did not know its full origin. Somewhere in the labyrinth of Middle Eastern informants, safe houses and intercepted communications, someone had whispered that Salome was in Rome, not hiding remarkably, but living almost openly under the protection of Italian leftist sympathizers who viewed the PLO as freedom fighters rather than terrorists. He moved between 3 different apartments, never establishing a pattern, never staying in one place long enough for surveillance to pin him down. The trail had actually begun in Beirut 6 months earlier, when a low-level PLO courier had been picked up by Mossad assets during a routine surveillance operation. The courier had not known anything significant, but in his wallet was a receipt from a restaurant in Rome, dated 3 weeks prior. On its own, the receipt meant nothing. But Mossad's intelligence analysts were trained to see patterns in chaos, to connect dots that others could not even perceive as existing. The receipt went into the system, was cross-referenced with thousands of other pieces of intelligence, and generated a correlation with a reported sighting of Salome in Italy from an asset who had previously been unreliable. That correlation was weak, barely worth following up, but it coincided with intercepted phone traffic from Rome to Beirut that mentioned meetings requiring high-level approval. Still circumstantial, still speculative, but the pattern was emerging. Then came the breakthrough. A Mossad agent working undercover in the Italian Communist Party heard gossip about an important Palestinian visitor who was dating the daughter of a prominent leftist politician. The description matched Salome. More importantly, the source mentioned that this visitor maintained an apartment on Via Veneto, in the heart of Rome's luxury district. That detail, combined with the other fragments, was enough to authorize a surveillance operation. The first team had arrived in Rome 8 months ago, posing as Dutch tourists. They had photographed every building on Via Veneto, documented every resident, tracked movement patterns, built up a complete database of normal activity so they could identify anomalies. The second team, posing as German businessmen, had set up long-range observation posts in hotels and apartments with sightlines to the target area. They worked in shifts, 12 hours on, 12 hours off, photographing everyone who entered or left the buildings under suspicion. For weeks, they found nothing. Then, on day 43 of the operation, a photographer using a telephoto lens captured an image of a man entering number 43 Via Veneto. The angle was poor, the lighting worse, but when the image was enhanced and analyzed in Tel Aviv, facial recognition software gave it an 87% probability match to Salome, not conclusive but promising. The surveillance intensified. Every person who entered that building was photographed, their movements tracked, their routines documented. Slowly, painstakingly, the analysts in Tel Aviv began to piece together the pattern. The man who might be Salome visited the third-floor apartment every 11 days, always at night, always alone, always staying for approximately 3 hours. On the 5th visit, they got a clear photograph through an apartment window. This time, the facial recognition software gave a 99.6% probability match. It was Salome. Except they had found a pattern. It had taken Mossad's analysts 6 weeks of tracking his movements, cross-referencing sightings, studying every scrap of intelligence before they noticed it. Every 11 days, Salome visited the apartment on Via Veneto. Always at night, always for exactly 3 hours, always leaving between 10 and 11 in the evening. The analysts could not determine why this location was special, whether it was a romantic liaison, a meeting with contacts, or simply a safe house he trusted more than others. It did not matter. The pattern was enough. Tonight was the 11th day. Ehud Barak glanced at his watch, the simple steel Timex that a parish priest might wear. 8:47 in the evening. If the pattern held, Salame would emerge within the next hour and 13 minutes. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. When he exited the building, Kimche would approach him as a priest asking for directions, getting close enough to confirm the identification beyond any doubt. Once confirmed, Barak would step from the car, and together they would force Salame into the Fiat. From there, a 2-minute drive to a warehouse Mossad had rented in the industrial district near Ostiense, where a third team waited with a chartered plane fueled and ready at Ciampino Airport. They would have him back in Israel within 8 hours. The trial would be swift, public, a reckoning for Munich that the world would watch. The rain eased to a drizzle, and the evening crowds emerged from doorways like flowers after a storm. Couples strolled arm in arm toward the Spanish Steps. Tourists consulted maps under the glow of street lamps. Businessmen hurried home with newspapers tucked under their arms. Rome's eternal rhythm continued, oblivious to the drama about to unfold. At 9:11, the building's main door opened. Kimche's entire body tensed. A woman emerged, elderly, walking a small white dog. He exhaled slowly, forcing his shoulders to relax. False alarm. Barak did not even look up from his newspaper, but Kimche knew his partner had registered the movement, categorized it, dismissed it, all in the fraction of a second it took for the woman to shuffle past. 9:23. A young couple laughing, the man's hand possessively on the woman's waist. 9:36. 2 teenagers smoking cigarettes, their conversation animated with the intensity of young rebellion. Kimche felt the familiar weight of waiting, the pressure that built in surveillance operations where every second stretched into geological time. He had done this before, in Beirut, in Athens, in Stockholm. Waiting was 90% of intelligence work, the endless grinding patience required to maintain absolute alertness, while nothing happened. The other 10% was violence so sudden and complete that years of waiting could be undone in seconds. He thought about Munich, as he often did during these operations. He had not been there, had been stationed in Brussels at the time, but every Mossad operative knew the details with the intimacy of personal trauma. The 11 hostages, Moshe Weinberg, Josef Romano, Zeev Friedman, David Berger, Yakov Springer, Eliezer Halfin, Josef Gutfreund, Kehat Shaw, Mark Slavin, Andrei Spitzer, Amitsur Shapira. Their names were inscribed in memory, in memorial, in the very purpose that drove operations like tonight. Salame had planned it all, had recruited the terrorists, had coordinated with German sympathizers to smuggle weapons into the Olympic Village, had orchestrated the timing to maximize international attention. And when German police had bungled the rescue attempt at Fürstenfeldbruck airfield, when all the hostages were murdered, Salame had disappeared into the Palestinian diaspora like a stone sinking into dark water. Until now. At 9:49, the door opened again. This time, Kimche knew immediately. The man who stepped onto Via Veneto moved with the careful awareness of someone who understood danger, whose eyes scanned the street in a pattern that was too systematic to be casual curiosity. He was tall, well-built, wearing an expensive leather jacket that spoke of money and connections. His face, even in the sodium vapor lamplight, matched the photographs Kimche had memorized. Strong jawline, dark eyes, black hair swept back from a high forehead. Ali Hassan Salame. Kimche's hand moved to the door handle, then stopped. Something was wrong. Salame was not alone. A second man had emerged with him, shorter, stockier, his right hand buried in his coat pocket, in a way that suggested a weapon. Then a third man positioning himself on Salame's other side. Bodyguards. The intelligence had never mentioned bodyguards. In all the surveillance reports, all the pattern analysis, Salame had always been alone when visiting this location. Always. Kimche's mind raced through options. The plan had accounted for a single target. 2 operatives working in coordination. 3 armed men changed everything. Even with the element of surprise, even with their training, the mathematics of violence were unforgiving. A gunfight on Via Veneto would be catastrophic, exposure guaranteed, the entire operation blown. Across the street, Barak had seen it too. The newspaper had lowered by a fraction of an inch, the only signal he would give. The question hung unspoken between them: abort or proceed? Salame and his escorts began walking north toward Piazza Barberini. In seconds they would be out of range, and the opportunity 117 days in the making would evaporate. Kimche made the decision. He stepped from the car. His movements were unhurried, the walk of a priest on an evening stroll, no urgency, no threat. He angled his path to intersect with Salame's group naturally, inevitably, the way strangers cross paths on city streets 1,000 times a day without incident. 20 meters, 15, 10. Salame's bodyguards had noticed him now, their attention sharpening. But what threat was a priest? One of them actually relaxed slightly, a nearly imperceptible shift in posture. 5 meters. Kimche manufactured a stumble, not quite a fall, just enough to require catching himself against a lamppost, just enough to appear momentarily disoriented. The universal language of an elderly man's fragility. "Father, are you all right?" The words came from Salame himself, spoken in Italian with a Palestinian accent, concern genuine in his voice. For all his reputation as a terrorist mastermind, he was still a man raised with certain courtesies, certain reflexes of compassion that years of violence had not entirely erased. Kimche looked up, and their eyes met. There was a moment, frozen in time, where recognition flickered across Salame's face. Not identification, not yet, but a sudden awareness that something was not quite right, that this priest's eyes held an intensity that did not match his elderly shuffle. Then everything happened at once. Barak was already moving, the Fiat's door flying open, his cassock billowing as he sprinted across the street. The bodyguards reacted instantly, hands yanking weapons from pockets and shoulder holsters, their training as sharp as any Mossad operatives. Salame backpedaled, his own hand reaching inside his leather jacket. Kimche's hand closed around the beretta hidden beneath his cassock, but he did not draw it. Drawing meant shooting. Shooting meant bodies on Via Veneto, witnesses, police, international incident. The mission was capture, not kill. Capture meant trial, justice, accountability. Kill meant martyrdom, another grievance for the propaganda machine. But the bodyguards had no such hesitation. The shorter one fired first, a sharp crack that echoed off the ancient buildings, the muzzle flash illuminating his face in a moment of stark clarity. The bullet went wide, shattering the window of a jewelry store, setting off alarms that shrieked into the night. Now the street erupted. Pedestrians screamed, diving for cover, running in blind panic. A woman fell, knocked down in the stampede, her purse spilling across the wet cobblestones. A delivery truck swerved, its horn blaring, crashing into a parked Vespa. Barak had his own weapon out now, but he was not firing, was instead trying to maneuver for a non-lethal shot, a leg, a shoulder, anything to disable without killing. The training was iron deep. Avoid casualties, avoid international incident, but above all, bring Salame in alive. Time seemed to fragment into disconnected moments, each one crystalline and eternal. Barak saw the second bodyguard's weapon rise, saw the muzzle align with his center mass, saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. His own body was already moving, dropping and rolling, the priest's cassock tangling around his legs like a shroud. The shot caught him in the upper arm instead of the chest, the impact spinning him sideways with force that felt like being hit with a hammer. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, white-hot fire radiating from the wound. But Barak's training held. He had been shot before twice, knew that the body's first response was panic and shutdown, knew that he had perhaps 10 seconds before the shock and blood loss would start to affect his motor control. He used those seconds with ruthless efficiency. His weapon came up, sights finding the second bodyguard's thigh, squeezing the trigger in a controlled double tap that had been drilled into muscle memory through thousands of hours at the range. The bodyguard went down hard, his own weapon clattering across the wet cobblestones, his screams adding to the cacophony of car alarms and terrified civilians. The first bodyguard, the shorter one who had fired first, was trying to acquire Kimche in his sights. But the press of panicking pedestrians made a clear shot impossible. People were running in every direction, a stampede of blind terror, bodies colliding and falling. A young woman stumbled directly into the bodyguard's line of fire, and he hesitated, a fraction of a second of humanity that proved fatal. Barak's third shot took him in the knee, a precise hit that severed ligaments and shattered bone. The second bodyguard fired 3 shots in rapid succession, one of them catching Barak in the upper arm, spinning him sideways. He went down hard, blood already darkening his cassock, but his weapon stayed level, trained on Salama. Blood was soaking through Barak's cassock now, warm and sticky, spreading in a dark stain that looked black under the streetlights. He could feel his heartbeat in the wound, each pulse sending fresh waves of pain and a gush of blood. The medical part of his brain, the part that had been trained in battlefield first aid, was already calculating blood loss rates, estimating how long he could remain conscious and effective. The numbers were not encouraging. Kimche moved then, not toward the gunfight, but laterally, cutting off Salame's escape route. The Red Prince was running now, surprising speed for a man of his build, heading toward a narrow alley between buildings. "Do not shoot," Kimche shouted in Hebrew, then caught himself, switched to Italian. "Police, stop!" The lie bought him 2 seconds. Salame hesitated, confused by the command, by the priest's sudden authority, by the chaos consuming the street. 2 seconds was enough. Kimche closed the distance, tackling Salame from the side, both men crashing into the wall of an apartment building hard enough to crack the ancient plaster. They went down together, Kimche's training taking over, his hands seeking control points, pressure points, leverage. But Salame was no amateur. He twisted, drove an elbow into Kimche's ribs with force that expelled air from his lungs, followed with a strike to the throat that Kimche barely deflected. They rolled across the sidewalk, cassock tangling around Kimche's legs, the false collar tearing away. The beretta had fallen from his grip, was somewhere in the gutter, lost in shadow and rainwater. Salame's hand found broken glass, a shard from the shattered jewelry store window. He slashed at Kimche's face, a wild swing that opened a cut across his cheek, blood mixing with rain. Kimche caught his wrist, twisted, heard bone crack. Salame screamed but did not release the glass, driving it toward Kimche's throat with desperate strength. The bodyguards were down, both of them. Barak had managed it despite his wound, 2 precise shots to legs, incapacitating without killing. But he was bleeding badly, his face grey with shock, barely keeping his weapon raised. Kimche slammed Salame's hand against the cobblestones once, twice, 3 times. The glass shard finally fell away. He drove a knee into Salame's solar plexus, followed with a palm strike to the chin that snapped the Palestinian's head back against the stone. Salame went limp. For 5 seconds, Kimche knelt there in the rain, breathing hard, blood running down his face, his hands shaking with adrenaline. The street was chaos, sirens already wailing in the distance, witnesses shouting, someone screaming for an ambulance. The mission was blown, completely, catastrophically blown. Barak stumbled over, his good hand grabbing Kimche's shoulder. "We need to move, now." Kimche looked down at Salame's unconscious form. So close. After years of hunting, after Munich, after everything, they had him. Right here. It would take 10 seconds to put a bullet in his head, to end it, to deliver justice in its most final form. But that was not the mission. That was not who they were. He stood, helping Barak toward the Fiat. The wounded man left a trail of blood, his cassock soaked through. The bodyguards were moaning. Conscious but immobilized, their weapons kicked away into gutters. As they reached the car, Kimche cast one last look at Salame. The Red Prince was already stirring, his hand moving to his head, consciousness returning. "Go!" Barak said through gritted teeth. "Just go." Kimche drove. Not fast, not drawing attention, just another vehicle navigating Rome's evening traffic. Behind them, police cars were converging on Via Veneto, their lights painting the Renaissance facades in blue and red. They had a safe house in Parioli, an apartment maintained under a different operations cover. Kimche drove there on autopilot, his mind already processing the disaster. The bodyguards would talk, probably already were talking. The Italian police would find shell casings, blood evidence, witnesses who saw priests with guns. The diplomatic fallout would be immense. At the safe house, Kimche worked on Barak's arm with the medical supplies they kept for emergencies. The bullet had passed through the muscle, missing bone, but the blood loss was serious. Barak needed a hospital, but hospitals meant questions, documentation, exposure. "How bad?" Barak asked, his voice weak. "Bad," Kimche admitted. He packed the wound with gauze, applied pressure. "You need stitches, real stitches." "We need to call in," Barak said. "Extraction." Kimche nodded. He moved to the radio, hidden in a false panel behind the refrigerator, began the process of contacting the emergency network. It would take hours to arrange. A ship from Haifa, a midnight rendezvous at Ostia, a route that would keep them out of airports and official checkpoints. While he worked, his mind kept returning to those 5 seconds, kneeling over Salame's unconscious body, the weight of the decision. Kill or walk away, justice or survival. He had chosen survival, had chosen the mission parameters over personal vengeance. But as he listened to Barak's labored breathing, as he felt the sting of the cut on his own face, he wondered if it had been the right choice. The extraction took 14 hours. They spent them in the safe house, monitoring Italian news broadcasts, watching the story unfold. 2 priests involved in a shootout on Via Veneto. 3 Palestinians wounded, 2 seriously. No deaths, miraculously, though one of the bodyguards would never walk without a limp again. The police were searching for the priests, had descriptions that were surprisingly accurate despite the chaos. The media had not connected it to Mossad yet, but they would. Some enterprising journalist would start asking questions, would notice the efficiency of the shooting, the tactical precision, would remember other mysterious attacks on PLO members across Europe. They reached the ship at dawn, a fishing trawler that stank of diesel and dead mackerel, its captain a Greek who asked no questions and would remember nothing. Barak was feverish by then, infection setting in, but he would survive. The ship's medic, another man with a past that invited no inquiry, administered antibiotics and intravenous fluids. Kimche stood on the deck as Rome disappeared behind them, the city's domes and spires fading into morning haze. He thought about Salame, wondered if the Red Prince was in a hospital or already disappeared again, warned by the attack, more cautious than ever. The mission had failed. That was the simple, brutal truth. They had not captured Salame, had not brought him to justice, had instead created an international incident that would complicate Israeli intelligence operations across Europe for years. But something else gnawed at Kimche, something deeper than tactical failure. In that moment when he had Salame at his mercy, when he could have ended it with a single shot, he had hesitated. Not from mercy, not from doubt about Salame's guilt, but from something more fundamental. The mission was supposed to be about justice, about accountability, about facing evil in open court where the world could witness and judge. Killing Salame in a Roman alley would have been vengeance, not justice. And vengeance, no matter how righteous it felt, was not what they were fighting for. Or was it? After Munich, after the systematic hunting of Black September members across Europe, after all the bodies left in hotel rooms and back alleys, what were they, if not instruments of vengeance? These questions would haunt Kimche for years. They would surface again 3 months later, when Mossad operatives in Norway killed an innocent waiter named Ahmed Bouchiki, mistaking him for Salame in what would become known as the Lillehammer affair. They would surface when some of the operatives involved in that disaster were arrested, tried, imprisoned, their covers blown, their careers destroyed. And they would surface most painfully on January 22nd, 1979, when a car bomb in Beirut finally killed Ali Hassan Salame, along with 4 of his bodyguards and 5 innocent bystanders. Mossad would claim credit for the assassination, though officially it remained attributed to the intelligence services of various nations, depending on who was telling the story. The Red Prince was dead, Munich was avenged, the chapter closed. But standing on that fishing trawler in 1979, watching Rome disappear, Kimche knew only failure. He did not know that Salame had only 4 more months to live. He did not know that the bodyguards who appeared that night on Via Veneto had been a last-minute addition, that Salome had received a warning from an Italian contact about possible Mossad surveillance. He did not know how close they had actually come, how many variables had aligned, and then, at the last moment, shifted by degrees small enough to be invisible but large enough to change everything. Intelligence work was like that. You made plans with incomplete information, executed them with imperfect resources, and lived with outcomes you could not control. Success and failure were often separated by factors you never saw, decisions made by people you never knew about, in rooms you never entered. All Kimche knew was that he had failed, that Barak was wounded, that their covers were burned, that Rome would never be safe for them again. Back in Tel Aviv, the debriefing was brutal. Rafi Eitan, the architect of the operation, listened to Kimche's report with a face carved from stone, his legendary calm never wavering, even as the dimensions of the disaster became clear. "You should have taken the shot," Eitan said finally. "The mission parameters were capture," Kimche responded. "The mission was Salome." Eitan leaned forward, his eyes hard. Capture was optimal, but completion was mandatory. You had completion in your hands and you walked away. He had bodyguards, 3 of them. "We would have had to shoot our way out. Casualties. International incident." "We have an international incident anyway," Eitan said. "At least we would have had Salame's body to show for it." Kimche had no answer to that. The logic was impeccable, brutal, correct. In the mathematics of intelligence operations, results were measured in outcomes, not intentions. They had intended to capture Salome, but they had achieved nothing except burned identities and a wounded operative. The mission to Rome was officially classified as a failure. The priest disguises were retired, deemed compromised. Kimche returned to desk work for 2 years, analyzing intelligence from field agents, building networks, running operations from behind a desk in Tel Aviv. The cut on his face healed into a thin white scar that he would carry for the rest of his life, a reminder of 5 seconds on a Roman street when everything hung in balance. Ehud Barak recovered from his wound, though his shoulder never regained full mobility. He left Mossad a year later, transitioned to the military, and would eventually become Prime Minister of Israel, though that future was unimaginable in the aftermath of Via Veneto. And Ali Hassan Salame continued his work with Black September and the PLO, moving between Beirut and European capitals, always protected, always dangerous, until the car bomb in 1979 finally caught him stepping out of his Range Rover on a quiet Beirut street. The explosion was massive, powerful enough to crater the road, to shatter windows 2 blocks away. Salame died instantly, along with 4 of his bodyguards. 5 bystanders, including a British teacher and a German nurse, were killed as well. 13 others were wounded, some permanently maimed. When Kimche heard about the assassination, he felt no satisfaction, no closure, only a weary acknowledgement that the mathematics of violence had finally caught up with Salome. The Red Prince had lived by those mathematics, had built his reputation on Munich and other operations calculated to maximize terror and international attention. It was perhaps inevitable that he would die the same way. But Kimche also thought about the 5 innocent people who died with Salome, about the British teacher, whose only crime was walking past at the wrong moment, about the German nurse who was simply doing her job. Collateral damage, the intelligence community called it, a sanitized phrase for bodies that were not supposed to be there, but ended up dead anyway. He thought about the mission in Rome, about the choice he had made, about walking away rather than taking the shot. At the time it had felt like failure, like weakness, like a betrayal of Munich and everything they were fighting for. But in the years that followed, as he watched the escalating violence between Israel and its enemies, as he saw the body count rise on both sides, as he witnessed the endless cycle of attack and retaliation and revenge, he began to wonder if walking away had actually been his only success. Not because Salame did not deserve to die. He did by any measure of justice or vengeance. But because the moment Kimche had chosen not to kill him, the moment he had prioritized mission parameters over personal satisfaction, he had preserved something essential about who they were and what they were fighting for. Israel was not supposed to be a nation of assassins, even though assassination had become a tool of survival. They were supposed to be better than their enemies, supposed to represent law and justice and accountability. Taking Salame in an alley because it was convenient would have been expedient, but it would have also been a surrender to the very logic that made Munich possible in the first place. These were the thoughts that occupied Kimche in the years that followed, during the quiet moments between operations, during the long nights when old missions replayed in memory with the clarity of fresh trauma. He never spoke about them, never shared these doubts with colleagues who might interpret them as weakness or hesitation. In Mossad, doubt was a luxury they could not afford. But he carried them nonetheless, carried them like he carried the scar on his face, like Barak carried the stiffness in his shoulder, like everyone who worked in intelligence carried the weight of decisions made in seconds that echoed for lifetimes. The priests of Via Veneto became a footnote in the larger history of Mossad operations, a mission that failed, an approach that was tried and abandoned. The files were sealed, classified at the highest levels, accessible only to those with need to know. The bodyguards who were shot that night recovered in Italian hospitals and then disappeared back into the Palestinian diaspora, their own stories becoming legends whispered in refugee camps and resistance cells. The witnesses who saw two priests with guns told their stories to police, to journalists, to anyone who would listen, but the details shifted and blurred with each retelling until they became part of Rome's endless collection of urban myths. Another strange tale in a city that had seen everything across 3,000 years of history, and life continued. Via Veneto returned to its normal rhythms of tourists and cafes and expensive boutiques. The jewelry store window was replaced, the blood washed away in the next rain. The bullet holes in ancient plaster were filled and painted over, invisible within days. Only Kimche and Barak and a handful of others knew what had really happened that night, knew how close they had come, knew what it meant and what it cost. In 1981, 2 years after Salame's death, Kimche was sitting in a cafe in Tel Aviv when a man approached his table. The man was Palestinian, well-dressed, his eyes tired. "You are David Kimche," the man said quietly in Arabic. Kimche's hand moved instinctively toward his waist, where he no longer carried a weapon, but where muscle memory still expected one. "Who are you?" "I was one of Ali Hassan Salame's bodyguards," the man said. "In Rome, I was the one you shot in the leg." Kimche stood, his chair scraping against the floor, ready to run or fight or call for help. But the man made no threatening move, simply stood there with his hands visible, empty. "I am not here for revenge," the man continued. "I am here because I need you to know something. That night in Rome, Salame knew you would be there. He had been warned. The bodyguards were a trap. He wanted Mossad to make a move so he could expose you, embarrass Israel, show the world that even the great Mossad could be outmaneuvered." "Why are you telling me this?" Kimche demanded. "Because you made a choice that night," the Palestinian said. "You could have killed him. You had the chance. I saw it. We all saw it. But you walked away. You chose the mission over revenge. And I have thought about that choice every day since." The man paused, his eyes distant. "Salame was my commander, my friend. I believed in what we were fighting for. But after Rome, after seeing what you chose, I began to question. Not whether our cause was just, but whether our methods were. Salame died the way he lived, in violence, taking innocence with him. You walked away. And somehow, in walking away, you won." Kimche sat back down slowly. The cafe around them continued its normal business, oblivious to the extraordinary conversation unfolding. "What happened to the other bodyguard?" "Dead," the man said simply. "Killed in Beirut 6 months after Salame. Still fighting, still believing. But I left. I could not do it anymore. Could not be part of the cycle." "Where are you now?" "Teaching," the man said. "History. At a university in Jordan. Teaching about the conflicts, about the violence, about the choices we make and the prices we pay." They sat in silence for a long moment, two men on opposite sides of an endless war, connected by 5 seconds on a Roman street where everything could have gone differently. "Thank you for telling me," Kimche said finally. The Palestinian nodded, then turned to leave. At the doorway he paused. "What you did in Rome walking away, that was not failure. That was the only victory worth having." Then he was gone, disappearing into the Tel Aviv crowds, another ghost among ghosts. Kimche sat there for a long time after, his coffee growing cold, his mind replaying that night for the 1000th time, but seeing it differently now. He had always viewed it as failure, as a mission that went wrong, as a choice that cost them their objective. But maybe the Palestinian was right. Maybe in the larger calculus of violence and revenge and justice, walking away had been the only choice that mattered. He thought about the 11 Israeli athletes who died at Munich, about the dozens of Palestinians killed in retaliation, about the hundreds of others caught in the crossfire, about the endless cycle that consumed lives and futures and possibilities, and he thought about how that cycle only ended when someone chose to walk away, chose mission over vengeance, chose to preserve some measure of humanity even in the darkest work. That night, he wrote a letter to Ehud Barak, who by then was deep in military command, planning operations that would define Israel's security for decades to come. In the letter, Kimche told him about the encounter with the Palestinian bodyguard, about the perspective it had given him, about the choice they had made. Barak's response came 2 weeks later, a single sentence. "We did the right thing, even if it was the wrong result." Those words would become Kimche's epitaph for the mission to Rome, the way he understood it in the years that followed. They had done the right thing, maintained their principles, preserved their mission parameters even when it would have been easier to abandon them. The wrong result, the failure to capture Salameh, was the price of doing it right. It was a price Kimche came to accept, even to embrace, because the alternative was becoming the very thing they were fighting against. In the decades that followed, David Kimche would rise to become Deputy Director of Mossad, would oversee operations across the Middle East and Europe, would make decisions that affected the course of nations. But he never forgot the lesson of Via Veneto, never forgot the 5 seconds when he chose to walk away, never forgot that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that look like defeat. Ehud Barak would become Prime Minister, would negotiate with Palestinians and Syrians, would make peace overtures that would ultimately fail, but which represented the same choice he had made in Rome, to try for something better than endless violence, even knowing the odds were against success. And somewhere in Jordan, a former bodyguard taught history to students who had been children when Munich happened, who knew the conflicts only as stories, not as lived experience. He taught them about the cycles of violence, about the choices that leaders make, about the moments when walking away requires more courage than fighting. The story of the priests of Via Veneto remained classified for 40 years, locked in files that were gradually declassified as participants died and the Cold War faded into history. When the files were finally opened, historians and journalists pored over them, trying to understand what had happened, what it meant, why the mission was considered a failure when it seemed to come so close to success. But the real story was not in the files, not in the operational details, or the tactical analysis or the diplomatic fallout. The real story was in the choice, in the 5 seconds when everything hung in balance, and the outcome was determined not by training or planning or intelligence, but by a decision about what kind of people they wanted to be. That was the victory of Via Veneto, the one that looked like failure, but was actually the only success that mattered. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.